Alright, so before we get into anything else, I need to clear something up, because there is a version of this story that has been floating around motorsport circles, dragging racing forums, and enthusiast YouTube channels for decades, and it is built on a foundation that does not hold up when you actually go looking for it. And here is why that matters. When the wrong version of a story gets told enough times, the right version stops sounding true. It sounds like a correction, and corrections are boring, and boring gets skipped, and then the wrong version wins permanently. That is not happening today. Here is the thing about automotive history in the performance era. The 1960s factory wars between Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors were not just racing programs. They were marketing weapons disguised as motorsport. Every track record, every national event win, every car that rolled under the lights at a drag strip was a direct argument made to the American car-buying public about whose engineering was worth trusting. And the people running those programs from the inside, the ones who conceived the cars, organized the teams, developed the technology, and still had time to climb in and drive, those people were carrying an enormous amount of weight that history has not always distributed fairly. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about factory racing programs and the engineers who built them from the ground up. If you're someone who wants to understand not just what happened on the track, but who actually made it happen and why the history books keep getting it slightly wrong, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now look, the name Dick Brannan comes up in A/FX histories, in factory lightweight discussions, in the footnotes of Thunderbolt articles and Mustang drag racing retrospectives. But here is what most people do not realize. The way his name shows up in those places dramatically undersells what he actually did. He gets listed. He gets mentioned. He gets tagged as a participant in a program that was, in fact, substantially his. That is a problem worth fixing. And before we even get to Brannan specifically, let's set the scene correctly. Because the landscape he walked into in 1962 was one of the most volatile and financially consequential moments in American motorsport history. The NHRA had been organized for less than a decade. The sanctioning structure was still being written in real time. The factories had officially agreed in 1957, through the Automobile Manufacturers Association, to withdraw from performance racing. No factory endorsements. No engineering resources directed at going fast. The AMA ban. It was supposed to level the playing field and clean up the optics of corporations bankrolling dangerous speed competitions. Now, you might be thinking, and this is a reasonable thing to think, that a formal agreement between major automotive manufacturers would actually be honored. General Motors and Chrysler were nodding along at the AMA meeting while continuing their racing programs behind a very thin curtain of corporate deniability. Ford, to their credit or their competitive detriment depending on how you look at it, actually stopped. They dismantled the racing operation and sold it off. And then they watched Chevrolet win everything for years while the market shifted toward performance in ways that made the AMA agreement look increasingly like unilateral disarmament. By 1961, Ford was creeping back in. By 1962, they were fully committed. Lee Iacocca was pushing a philosophy called total performance. The argument was elegant and brutally simple. If your cars win races, your cars are better than the cars they beat. And every American who wants a better car will walk into a Ford dealership to get one. It was not complicated thinking. It was correct thinking. And it worked. Ford's market share and performance brand identity shifted measurably during the years when total performance was functioning as policy. The man chosen to execute the drag racing component of that philosophy at the operational level was a 22-year-old with an engineering background, a Navy flight license, and a talent for going very fast in American automobiles. His name was Richard H. Brannan. He grew up in Tennessee, relocated to South Bend, Indiana, studied mechanical engineering and business at Tri-State University in Angola, did a stint in the Navy Reserve flying out of Pensacola, made lieutenant junior grade, and then went to work at Romyham's Ford in South Bend as a car salesman. His father had sold Ford. The loyalty was structural. In 1962, with backing from the dealership, Brannan took a Ford Galaxie 406 to Detroit Dragway. Car number 823. He beat more than 60 competitors and won the class outright. A virtually unknown driver from a local dealership sponsorship just cleared the entire field at one of the most visible drag racing venues in the country. Ford noticed. They appointed him race coordinator of their factory drag team. He was 22 years old, and he went to work at the Ford Engineering Center in Dearborn. Here is where it gets really interesting. Most people in motorsport history occupy one lane. They are either the driver or the engineer or the program administrator. Brannan occupied all three simultaneously, and the way those roles fed each other is what made Ford's program technically sophisticated in ways that pure administrators could not have achieved and pure drivers would not have prioritized. That dual-role identity is also exactly why his name ends up in the footnotes instead of the headline. History is better at filing people in single categories. That is what we are correcting today. And we are just getting started. The 1963 season is where the Brannan story stops being an interesting origin story and starts being something you genuinely cannot explain away as luck or timing. Because what he built that year, with his own hands and his own engineering instincts, was not the product of a factory program handing a driver a finished weapon. It was a guy who understood physics and chassis dynamics and the specific problem of putting power to pavement, solving problems that did not have catalog solutions yet because the catalog had not been written. The car was a 1963.5 Galaxie 500, car number 824, finished in Wimbledon White, running the 427 FE side oiler. Ford rated that engine at around 425 horsepower in street trim, but the race-prepared version with the correct intake, carburation, and ignition work was producing closer to 550. The car wore fiberglass hood and front fenders, aluminum bumpers, and a stripped interior down to rubber floor mats and lightweight police package seat. Ford had been aggressive about weight reduction everywhere the rules allowed. But the weight reduction was only half the equation. The other half was getting that power to translate into forward motion consistently, and that is where most of the competition was losing ground. Here is the thing about drag racing in 1963. The technology of chassis tuning for the quarter mile was genuinely primitive compared to even 5 years later. Everybody understood that traction mattered. Fewer people understood the specific mechanical interventions that produced it reliably. Brannan approached this as an engineer rather than as a hot rodder, and the distinction shows in what he actually did to the car. The line lock system is the most documented example. Brannan wanted to do a controlled burnout to heat the rear tires before a run while holding the front brakes stationary, which is standard procedure now but was not a solved problem in 1963. There was no bolt-on solution. He sourced a Studebaker Hill Holder master cylinder, which was designed for a completely different application on a completely different type of vehicle, and he adapted it into a functional line lock system. To run the linkage properly, he cut 3 holes in the firewall. He built the whole thing himself. Nobody told him to use a Studebaker part. Nobody handed him a schematic. He looked at the problem, identified what mechanical behavior he needed, found the closest existing component that could produce that behavior in a different context, and made it work. That is engineering thinking applied to racing, not racing instinct applied to engineering. The difference is meaningful because engineering thinking scales. You can document it, refine it, teach it, and apply it to the next car. Racing instinct produces results in the hands of the person who has it and does not transfer as cleanly. He also rearched the rear leaf springs to preload the suspension geometry for launch, which shifted the attitude of the car at the moment of maximum acceleration. He ran a single control arm on one side of the rear axle to help manage the twisting force that a high-torque engine produces through the drivetrain during a launch sequence. and he put a screw jack on the driver's side front coil spring to offset the rotational torque of the engine, which was pulling the car left under hard acceleration, so that it would track straight down the groove instead of drifting toward the wall. None of these solutions existed as purchasable components in 1963. They existed because Brannan identified problems, understood their mechanical origins, and fabricated solutions from available materials. A Studebaker master cylinder, a screw jack, re-arch springs. The improvisation is not the point. The point is that the improvisation was correct, and correct improvisation under competitive pressure is what separates engineers who can race from racers who can wrench. The results of all this work were not marginal. The 1963 season produced 65 or more event wins, 22 track records set at venues across the country. On July 13 at York US 30 Dragway, Brannan set the first NHRA Super Stock Class record for Ford. The National Drag Racing Press started calling him the fastest Ford alive. The car acquired a name, the Lively One, and that name stuck with Brannan the way good names stick when they are actually earned. Now, you might be thinking, and this is a fair thing to think, that winning 65 events in a single season is an extraordinary number and deserves some context. In 1963, the drag racing calendar was dense, the regional circuit was active, and a well-funded factory effort with a car that was genuinely faster than the competition could accumulate wins at a rate that seems implausible by modern standards when the top-tier national events are relatively few and the fields are more evenly matched. 65 wins in 1963 represents a genuine dominance of available competition, not an inflated statistic from a thin field. The 22 track records make the same argument more precisely, because track records require an objective time standard, not just beating whoever shows up on a given weekend. While all of this was happening on the track, Brannan was also performing the coordinator role. And here is what most people do not realize about what that job actually meant in 1962 and 1963. It was not an administrative position in the way a modern motorsport program director role might be described. It meant bridging the gap between Ford's corporate engineering resources in Dearborn and the actual competitive reality of drag strips across the country, where the rules were evolving, the competition was escalating, and the decisions about where to allocate development effort had to be made by someone who understood both sides of that equation simultaneously. Brannan was reporting up through Charlie Gray, who ran Ford's overall racing efforts under John Cowley. He eventually moved to the third floor of Ford Division World Headquarters. The kid from South Bend who had shown up at Detroit Dragway as a nobody was now sitting inside one of the most powerful automotive companies in the world, coordinating not just drag racing but NASCAR Grand National efforts, Le Mans programs, and early IndyCar engine development. The scope of what he was managing was genuinely vast, and he was doing it while still driving the cars. Which brings us to the project that transitions Brannan from interesting career story to genuinely essential figure in the history of American drag racing. Because the Thunderbolt was his idea. Not his idea in the sense that he contributed to a team discussion. His idea in the sense that he arranged for 10 two-door Ford Fairlanes to be shipped to Dearborn Steel Tubing, Andy Houghton's fabrication shop, and he received the first car off the build. The program did not exist without him conceiving it and pushing it through Ford's internal structure. And the Thunderbolt, when it came out the other end of DST's shop, was something the NHRA had not quite seen before, though they were about to see a lot more of it. The 427 FE high-riser with dual 4-barrel Holley carburetors stuffed into a substantially reworked engine bay. Fiberglass fenders and hood. The high-beam headlight openings replaced with mesh-covered ram air intake scoop. Interior stripped completely. Battery moved to the trunk. Every pound that could be removed was removed while maintaining technical legality for super stock competition. The first test run with Brannan driving produced a 12.26 at 122 miles per hour and pulled the rear window clean out of the car. It went approximately 50 feet into the air behind the vehicle, which is one of those testing moments that tells you two things at once. The aerodynamic situation requires attention, and the car has power. Both of those things were true and both got addressed. Testing at Lyons Drag Strip in November of 1963, before the car was publicly revealed, produced an 11.61 at 124.8 miles per hour with the 4-speed transmission. At the 1964 NHRA Winter Nationals, Brannan ran 11.80 at 128 miles per hour. When NHRA saw what the Thunderbolt was doing in competition, they required Ford to produce at least 100 examples for homologation. Dearborn Steel Tubing built approximately 100, split between 4-speed and automatic transmissions, painted either vintage burgundy for the first 11 or white for the remainder, and distributed them to dealerships and racers across the country. They immediately started winning things. Gas Ronda took the 1964 NHRA Stock World Championship in a Thunderbolt that Brannan had helped develop. The car did exactly what total performance needed it to do. It proved the 427 was real, that Ford's engineering was legitimate, and that the guys racing blue ovals could compete with anyone on the property. But something was coming that would make winning significantly harder. And it was coming from Chrysler. And it involved a question about wheelbase that nobody had thought to ask yet, but that would change the shape of drag racing permanently. The question Chrysler asked was deceptively simple. The rulebook said factory experimental cars had to be based on production platforms with stock wheelbases. It said that clearly enough. What it did not say, with sufficient precision, was exactly how much you could move the axles before the wheelbase stopped being stock. And when Chrysler's people sat down with that rulebook and looked at it the way a lawyer looks at a contract rather than the way a racer looks at a starting line, they found something that should not have been there. Room. Here is the thing about technical regulations in any motorsport at any level. They are written by people who are trying to describe the present state of competition while anticipating a future state that has not happened yet. And the gap between what the rulebook writer imagined and what a motivated engineer with factory resources can actually build is always larger than the rulebook writer expected. Always. Every sanctioning body in the history of organized motorsport has learned this lesson the hard way, and the NHRA learned it in 1965 in a way that permanently altered the trajectory of drag racing as a category. Chrysler took their Dodge Coronets and Plymouth Belvederes to a shop in a Detroit suburb called Amblewagon. 12 cars total, 6 of each. And what Amblewagon did to those cars was not subtle. The rear axle came forward 15 inches from its stock position. The front suspension moved forward 10 inches. The wheelbase dropped from 117 inches down to approximately 110, which shifted roughly 56% of the car's total weight directly over the rear tires. The bodies were acid-dipped to remove as much material as possible and then fitted with aluminum and fiberglass panels and Lexan windshield. The engines were injected HEMAS running on nitromethane. These cars ran mid-nines at over 140 miles per hour when the best factory stock alternatives were running high tens. That is not a small performance gap. That is a different category of vehicle wearing a production car's name as a costume. The altered wheelbase Mopars were not faster versions of the Dodge Coronet. They were purpose-built drag racing weapons that happened to share a body stamp with a car you could buy at a dealership, and the distinction matters because the entire premise of factory superstock and A/FX competition was that the cars being raced had some meaningful relationship to the cars being sold. NHRA looked at the altered wheelbase Chrysler cars and did what sanctioning bodies do when a competitor finds a gap in the rulebook large enough to drive a tube frame race car through. They closed it. A new rule limited wheelbase changes to 2% of the stock measurement, which effectively banned the Amblewagon cars from NHRA A/FX competition. The Chrysler altered wheelbase machines scattered to NHRA events and the match race circuit, where NHRA rules did not apply and where the money was, frankly, considerably better than at most sanctioned national events anyway. This created a serious structural problem for Ford's A/FX program. Because the match race circuit was where the real visibility lived in 1965. Promoters booked match races because drama sold tickets, and nothing sold tickets like putting a Ford against a Mopar in a head-to-head pairing where the crowd already had an opinion about who was going to win. The problem was that on that circuit, against those cars, Ford's rule-compliant Mustang A/FX entries were outgunned. The performance gap was real, and it was large, and it was not something you could tune your way out of without addressing the fundamental weight distribution and fuel chemistry advantages the Chrysler cars had built into their architecture. Ford's official response had two components. The first was to instruct their A/FX drivers not to accept head-to-head match race bookings against the Mopar altered wheelbase cars. Losing publicly on the match race circuit was a worse outcome for total performance marketing than simply declining the booking. The optics of a no-show are recoverable. The optics of your factory-backed car getting destroyed on camera by the competition are considerably harder to walk back when you are simultaneously running television advertisements arguing that Ford wins races because Ford builds better cars. The second component was giving Brannan room to develop an answer. And this is where his dual role becomes most valuable, because the answer he developed was not a committee decision or a corporate directive. It was a car he built himself to solve a specific competitive problem with the engineering instincts he had been applying since he cut 3 holes in a firewall to install a Studebaker line lock on a Galaxie in 1963. But before we get to that answer, we need to talk about the car that opened 1965, because that car is the legitimate centerpiece of Brannan's driving career and one of the most historically significant factory drag racing programs ever executed by an American manufacturer. On November 29, 1964, Ford sent requests to quote to both Dearborn Steel Tubing and Holman-Moody for the construction of 10 A/FX Mustangs. DST could not meet the production deadline. The contract went to Holman-Moody in Charlotte, North Carolina, which was already functioning as Ford's most capable external fabrication resource from their NASCAR-banned national work. Holman-Moody received stripped Mustang fastback shells and spent approximately 80.5 hours per car performing modifications that cost roughly $11,170 per unit. They then sold each finished car to its assigned driver for $1. $1, with retroactive certificates of origin issued April 23, 1965. The VIN documentation for these 10 cars is preserved, and it tells you something precise and important about Brannan's position within the program hierarchy. The lowest VIN in the batch, 5F09K380230, went to Dick Brannan at Romehams Ford in South Bend. He got the first car off the line. Car number 2 went to a show car. Car 3 went to Bill Lawton at Tosca Ford. Les Ritchie, Phil Bonner, Gas Ronda, Al Joniek, and the remaining drivers received the others. The VIN sequence is not random. It reflects priority within the program structure. And Brannan's name is on the lowest number. He named his car Goldfinger, after the Bond film that had just been released. If you understand the era and you are looking at a gold-colored car that goes very fast and has a certain theatrical quality to its competitive presence, that is an extremely correct name. The first 7 cars in the build received the 427 SOHC, Ford's single overhead cam engine, which had been developed in approximately 90 days as a direct engineering response to the 426 Hemi dominating the 1964 Daytona 500. Here is what most people do not realize about the SOHC program. Ford built that engine under extraordinary time pressure specifically to compete at the highest level of NASCAR. The Cammer, as everyone called it, used cast iron heads with hemispherical combustion chambers, a single overhead cam per bank driven by a 6-foot roller chain, and intake valves measuring 2.25 inches with 1.90-inch exhausts. Compression was 12-1. Ford rated it at 616 horsepower at 7,000 revolutions per minute with a single 4-barrel carburetor, or 657 horsepower at 7,500 with dual carbs. Bill France at NASCAR looked at this engine and called it European Exotica. Then he banned it immediately, which left Ford with an engine program that had consumed enormous development resources, produced genuinely extraordinary power, and now had exactly one competitive outlet: drag racing. The A/FX Mustangs were not just racing cars. They were the only place left where the SOHC program could justify its existence, and that gave the program a weight and urgency that pure motorsport competition would not have generated on its own. The modifications Holman-Moody performed on the Mustang shells were comprehensive. Fiberglass replaced steel on the front fenders, hood, and doors. Every glass panel except the rear hatch went to polycarbonate. The shock towers were removed and reworked. Holman-Moody fabricated a unique torsion-type front suspension to handle the Cammer's considerable mass, because the engine weighed approximately 680 pounds and the stock Mustang front end was not designed to carry that load. A fiberglass teardrop hood went over it to clear the valve covers. The rear axle moved forward by roughly 2% of the stock wheelbase, which was the exact legal maximum under the new NHRA rule. Later in the season, most of the cars switched to Hillborn fuel injection with large velocity stacks, which changed both the power delivery and the visual drama of the cars substantially. On the match race circuit, these Mustangs were spectacular in the most literal sense of the word. Gas Ronda set the A/FX class record at the NHRA World Finals at 10.43 seconds and 134.73 miles per hour. Bill Lawton won the A/FX class at the 1965 NHRA Winter Nationals. These were real times from real cars, making Ford's argument in the one place where the argument cannot be manufactured. The timing slipped, and yet the tension was building, because on the match race circuit against the Mopar altered wheelbase cars, the performance gap remained. And Brannan, who was simultaneously managing the program and driving Goldfinger and thinking about what came next, was already working on the answer. He called it the Bronco, and what it represented was not just a solution to the immediate competitive problem. It was, depending on how you date these things, and historians do argue about the dating, one of the first factory funny cars ever built. The escalation that produced the Bronco also produced the next phase of Holman-Moody construction, which took the cars so far beyond their production origins that the NHRA had to create an entirely new classification framework just to accommodate them. And that framework, that moment of institutional reckoning with what the factories had actually built, is where the funny car era truly begins. With Brannan's program at the center of it. The Bronco did not arrive with a press release or a factory announcement or a corporate rollout coordinated through Ford Division World Headquarters. It arrived because one man looked at a competitive problem, understood it at an engineering level, and built the solution himself. That is the thread that runs through everything Brannan did from the Studebaker line lock forward. Not waiting for the catalog. Not submitting a proposal and waiting for committee approval. Identifying the problem, finding the materials, and making the thing that needed to exist. Here is the thing about the match race circuit in 1965. It operated outside the NHRA sanctioning structure, which meant the rulebook that had banned the Chrysler altered wheelbase cars at national events did not apply. Promoters could book whatever they wanted. Crowds would pay to see whatever went fast, and the Mopar AWB cars were going fast in ways that the rule-compliant Ford A/FX Mustangs simply could not match on that particular stage. The weight distribution advantage that came from moving the rear axle forward 15 inches was not something you could overcome with carburetor tuning or spring rate adjustments. It was baked into the architecture of the car. Brannan's answer was the 1965 Mustang, he called the Bronco. Altered wheelbase, not rule-compliant for NHRA/FX competition, specifically built for the match racing world where the rules were whatever the promoter said they were and the competition was whoever showed up with the fastest car. The Bronco ran the SOHC 427 and wore an extremely lightweight fiberglass body. It was built to compete directly in the same environment as the Mopar AWB machines, which meant it needed to address the same fundamental physics those cars had exploited. Weight over the rear tires, minimum overall mass, maximum power from the cammer. AMT, the model kit manufacturer, produced a 1/25th scale kit of this car under the name Dick Brannan's Bronco Mustang Funny Car. That is interesting phrasing from a company that was producing kits in 1965. Because the term funny car was just entering the vocabulary of drag racing at exactly this moment. It was not yet a formal NHRA class. It was a description that track announcers and racing press writers were reaching for when they needed to describe cars that looked like production vehicles but behaved like nothing a civilian would recognize. The Bronco fit that description precisely. Historians credit the Bronco as the first Ford altered wheelbase car and one of the earliest examples of what would formally become the funny car category. The competitive pressure it created was real enough that Chrysler reportedly felt the need to respond by further developing their own cars with additional fuel injection hardware and more aggressive fuel chemistry. The escalation spiral, which had started with the AMA ban being quietly ignored and accelerated through factory lightweights and A/FX Mustangs and altered wheelbase Mopars, was now spinning faster than the sanctioning bodies could track it. Look, this is where the history of drag racing in the mid-1960s becomes genuinely difficult to follow if you are trying to understand it through the lens of any single team or manufacturer or car, because everything was moving simultaneously and every move by one side produced a countermove from the other, and the technology was evolving faster than the institutional framework could process it. The NHRA was not slow or incompetent. They were simply trying to write rules for a future that was arriving before they could finish the sentence. For 1966, Holman-Moody built approximately 8 more Mustangs for the Ford program. And these cars had essentially no meaningful relationship to the production Mustang beyond the shape of the body panels. They were scratch-built tube-frame chassis. All fiberglass bodies. The front end extended 16 inches from the stock position. The rear axle moved forward dramatically from where even the 1965 cars had placed it. The 427 SOHC received Hillborn fuel injection with large velocity stacks that made the engine look as theatrical as it performed. These cars weighed nearly 1,000 pounds less than the previous generation of Holman-Moody Mustangs. Lee Holman later estimated the build cost at approximately $30,000 per car. In 1966 dollars, which translates to something in the neighborhood of $250,000 in current purchasing power per unit. Ford was spending $250,000 chunks of money on individual race cars in a program that Brannan was coordinating from inside Ford Division World Headquarters, and the cars they were producing were so far beyond anything the rulebook had anticipated that the NHRA had to look at them and ask a question they had not expected to ask. What class does this belong in? The answer they arrived at was C/fuel dragsters. Not funny cars, because the funny car class as a formal NHRA category did not yet exist in the configuration we recognize today. Fuel dragsters, because the cars were running on nitromethane and producing elapsed times and terminal speeds that placed them in the performance window of dedicated dragster machinery rather than anything resembling a production-based vehicle. That classification decision is one of the most revealing moments in the entire story, because it tells you exactly how far the escalation had traveled. These were cars wearing Mustang bodies. Ford Mustangs. The most important passenger car Lee Iacocca had ever put his name on, the vehicle that had generated over 400,000 sales in its first year and created an entirely new market segment that competitors were still scrambling to address. And the NHRA looked at the 1966 Holman-Moody versions of that car and said the closest thing we have in our rulebook is a fuel dragster. That gap between the showroom Mustang and the NHRA fuel dragster wearing a Mustang costume is the measure of how extreme the factory wars had become. Brannan was operating a fleet of these cars, multiple long-nose Mustangs running under the Ford program umbrella, with different drivers at different venues across the country, all of them coordinated through the program structure he had built from the ground up since 1962. He was the connective tissue between Ford's corporate resources and the competitive reality of what was happening at the Strip. He was also still driving, still testing, still making the calls about which direction the development should go next. Here is what most people do not realize about what it means to run a program at that level while also driving the cars. The feedback loop is different. A program director who does not drive gets information filtered through the drivers, through their descriptions of what the car is doing, through their interpretations of why a particular run went the way it did. A program director who drives gets the information directly, in his hands and his feet and his sense of what the car wants to do at the launch and through the light. Brannan was getting both kinds of information simultaneously and making decisions that reflected both, and the quality of those decisions shows in the competitive results the program produced. Now, you might be thinking that, at some point the factories were going to look at what they had built and ask whether it still served the original marketing purpose. And that is exactly the right question, because the answer to it is what ended Ford's A/FX era. The logic of total performance was that racing victories translated to showroom credibility. A Thunderbolt winning super stock at a national event could be photographed, written about, connected in the public imagination to the production Galaxie or Fairlane it was based on. A customer walking into a Ford dealership could look at a race win and see something that had at least a visual relationship to the car on the lot. A tube-frame scratch-built Holman-Moody fuel dragster wearing a fiberglass Mustang body and filed under C/fuel dragster by the NHRA because no other category fit? That car was not selling Mustangs. It was not meant to sell Mustangs. It was a competition weapon that had evolved past the point where the marketing logic that created it could still be applied to it. The connection between the race car and the showroom car had broken down completely, and when that connection breaks down, the factory justification for the program breaks down with it. Spring 1967, Ford pulled the plug. The official language, as Brannan himself co-wrote in the book Extreme Muscle Cars, the factory lightweight legacy was that Ford chose not to sponsor the A/FXers in 1967, preferring instead to concentrate on production car performance and image. That is a diplomatic sentence. What it describes is a corporation recognizing that the escalation had taken the cars to a place where they could no longer serve the purpose they were built for, and making the decision to redirect those resources toward programs that maintained the connection between racing and the showroom. Brannan dissolved his funny car operation and put the fleet up for sale. Hubert Platt, who had been one of Ford's most effective regional racers through the A/FX era, took the quickest car in the bunch, a Holman-Moody long-nose injected Mustang, and carried it forward into the emerging funny car era as a privateer. That car eventually passed to Larry Coleman, who renamed it Super Ford Jr. and ran it as the funny car class formalized around exactly the type of machine it represented. The cars that Brannan's program had built were not the end of something. They were the prototype of what came next. The funny car class that the NHRA eventually formalized, the flip-top fuel cars that would dominate the 1970s and become one of drag racing's most enduringly spectacular categories, descended directly from the logic that produced the 1966 Holman-Moody Mustangs. Tube frame, fiberglass body, fuel injection, nitromethane, minimum weight, maximum power. The architecture was identical. Only the institutional recognition was missing, and that arrived shortly after Brannan's program ended. He had built the category before the category had a name. Pro Stock in 1970 was not a mature class with an established competitive hierarchy and a settled technical formula. It was an experiment, a sanctioning body looking at what production-based drag racing could be if you stripped away the factory exotic machinery and the altered wheelbase cars and the tube-frame funny car escalation and asked a simpler question. What happens when serious racers build the fastest possible version of a car that a civilian could theoretically purchase? The answer turned out to be one of the most technically demanding and competitively brutal categories in the history of the sport. And Brannan walked into it carrying everything he had learned from 6 years of running the most sophisticated factory program in American drag racing. Here is the thing about transitioning between eras in motorsport. The skills do not always transfer. A driver who dominated one technical formula can arrive in a new one and find that everything he knew about chassis tuning and power delivery and race day decision-making applies to a completely different set of variables than the ones he is now facing. The engine package is different. The weight distribution targets are different. The tire behavior is different. The competition has been developing their combinations for months or years before you arrive, and they have already solved problems you have not encountered yet. Brannan arrived in Pro Stock with advantages that most new entrants did not have. He had engineering training that let him approach a new technical problem systematically rather than empirically. He had years of experience developing Ford's race engines, including the 428 Cobra Jet and the 429 Super Cobra Jet that Ford was positioning for Pro Stock competition. He had relationships inside Ford's engineering structure that gave him access to development resources that independent racers could not easily reach. And he had the competitive instincts of someone who had been winning drag races at a high level since 1962. What he did not have, at least initially, was the specific combination knowledge that the Chrysler teams had accumulated. SOHC and Martin, running Plymouth, had the Pro Stock formula closer to sorted than anyone else in the early years of the class. Ronnie SOHC was perhaps the most technically precise driver in the category, a man whose reaction times and consistency under pressure were so reliable that competing against him on a good day required everything to go right on your side and something to go slightly wrong on his. The Chrysler teams understood their engines, their transmissions, their chassis, and their tire combinations at a level of specificity that took time to develop and could not be shortcut by engineering credentials alone. The first ever Pro Stock event at a national level was the 1970 NHRA Winter Nationals. 3 SOHC Ford Mavericks competed in it. All 3 were eliminated in the first round. That result was not a reflection of Brannan's program specifically, but it was a clear statement about where Ford's Pro Stock effort stood relative to the Chrysler teams at the starting point of the class. The Cammer, which had been the centerpiece of Ford's A/FX program and had produced such extraordinary results in that context, was not necessarily the correct answer for a class with different rules, different weight minimums, and different technical parameters than the A/FX world it had been developed for. The development process through 1970 and into 1971 was iterative. Brannan was racing out of the Atlanta area by this point, based in Marietta, Georgia, which is how his name ends up in the Georgia Racing Hall of Fame later. The regional identity matters because the Southeast drag racing community in the early 1970s was serious and well-funded and competitive in ways that gave regional racers genuine preparation for national events. Running against strong regional competition on a regular basis is not the same as running against the national field, but it is considerably better preparation than running against weak regional competition, and the Southeast was not weak. By 1971, Brannan was qualified for the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pro Stock. His first-round pairing was Ronnie SOHC, the number 1 qualifier. SOHC was on another level that particular weekend. The result was an elimination in the opening round, which is a factually accurate description of what happened and also a somewhat misleading way to characterize the significance of being at the national event, in the field, and drawing the fastest qualifier in the first round. Losing to Ronnie Sox in round 1 of a national pro stock event in 1971 was not a story about being outclassed by the field. It was a story about the bracket luck of the draw placing you against the single most dangerous competitor in the category on one of his better weekends. Here is what most people do not realize about early pro stock competition from this era. The margin between the top cars was genuinely small in terms of elapsed times, and the variance introduced by reaction time, track conditions, and mechanical consistency was large relative to that margin. A driver who could run a consistent 9.8 in every round was more dangerous than a driver who could occasionally run a 9.6 but whose consistency was less reliable. Sox's advantage was not just that his cars were fast. It was that his execution was extraordinarily precise, and precision under pressure compounds over the course of a race day in ways that raw speed alone does not. This is where it gets really interesting, because 1972 is the year that puts the definitive number on Brannan's pro stock career and answers the question of whether his transition into the new class represented genuine competitive capability or just the residual momentum of a factory program that no longer existed. The 1972 NHRA Super Nationals. Dick Brannan reached the pro stock final. Let that land for a moment, because reaching a national event final in any era of professional drag racing requires winning multiple rounds against competitive fields, maintaining mechanical reliability across an entire race day, and executing under the specific pressure of elimination format competition where one bad run ends everything. He ran a 9.60 second elapsed time in the final round. That was a legitimate, competitive elapsed time in 1972 pro stock. The class had not yet reached the 9.0 barrier that would define the mid-decade competition, and a 9.60 represented a car that was genuinely well-developed and a driver who was executing at a high level. He lost to Bill Jenkins, who ran a 9.365 to win the event. Let's talk about Bill Jenkins for a moment, because context matters here. Jenkins, known universally as Grumpy, was in 1972 running one of the most technically sophisticated pro stock programs in the country. He was an engine builder of exceptional capability, a chassis tuner who understood weight transfer and tire dynamics at a level that most of his contemporaries were still working toward, and a racer whose preparation was so thorough that his cars consistently performed at their theoretical maximum rather than somewhere below it. Losing to Jenkins in a national final in 1972 was not a story about being outclassed. It was a story about going up against the best-prepared combination in the class on one of Jenkins' best weekends and running a 9.60 that was not quite fast enough to beat a 9.365. Second place at a national event. 10 years into a career that had started with a class win at Detroit Dragway in 1962. The thread from that first win to the 1972 Super Nationals final is not an accident or a coincidence. It is the product of engineering discipline applied consistently across a decade of competition in categories that kept changing around him, requiring constant adaptation and constant development without the luxury of a stable technical formula to optimize against. Now, you might be thinking that a career with that kind of documented achievement, 65-plus wins in a single season in 1963, 22 track records that same year, the first NHRA Superstock class record for Ford, the conception and development of the Thunderbolt, the coordination of the A/FX Mustang program, the construction of one of the first factory funny cars, and a national event pro stock final in 1972, should produce a figure who is significantly better known than Dick Brannan actually is. And you would be right. It should. The gap between what Brannan accomplished and how prominently those accomplishments register in the general drag racing historical consciousness is real, and it is worth examining directly. Part of the answer is structural. Individual drivers get remembered through their most spectacular moments, their most famous cars, their most dramatic victories. Brannan's most spectacular moments were often inseparable from the program he was running, which means the story of the moment includes the team, the manufacturer, the engineering context, and a supporting cast of other drivers who were also winning in the same cars. When Gas Ronda wins the 1964 NHRA Stock World Championship in a Thunderbolt, that is a Thunderbolt story and a Ronda story. The fact that Brannan conceived the Thunderbolt and put the program together is background information rather than headline information in the way that story typically gets told. Part of the answer is the dual role problem. History is better at filing people in single categories than at accommodating people who operate across multiple categories simultaneously. Brannan was a driver and an engineer and a program coordinator, and the contributions he made in each of those roles reinforced each other in ways that are genuinely difficult to separate out and assign credit for individually. The engineering work made the cars faster. The driving work made the engineering feedback direct and unfiltered. The coordination work made the program coherent and capable of executing across multiple cars and drivers simultaneously. You cannot pull one of those roles out and evaluate it independently because they were not independent. They were one integrated operation running through one person. And part of the answer, frankly, is the mistaken identity problem we opened with. The Dandy Dick confusion, where Brannan's name gets attached to a nickname that belonged to Dick Landy of Dodge, creates a small but persistent static in the historical signal. People researching one Dick find references to the other Dick, and the cross-contamination introduces uncertainty that makes both stories slightly harder to follow than they should be. Brannan did not need a borrowed nickname. He had his own, Mr. Ford, the lively one. Names that were earned specifically and belonged to him specifically and described something real about what he had built. The record is there for anyone who goes looking. The Georgia Racing Hall of Fame documents more than 200 wins across his career. The NHRA records confirm the 1972 Super Nationals final. The VIN list for the A/FX Mustangs puts his name on the lowest number. The 3 holes in the firewall of Galaxie number 824 are there when you look for them. And those 3 holes are where the next part of this story goes, because the authentication of Brannan's original Galaxie decades after it was built is one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in the entire history of factory drag racing preservation. And it turns on exactly the detail you would expect from an engineer who solved problems by cutting holes in firewalls and sourcing parts from other manufacturers and building things himself because the catalog did not have what he needed. The record is there for anyone who goes looking. The Georgia Racing Hall of Fame documents more than 200 wins across his career. The NHRA records confirm the 1972 Super Nationals final. The VIN list for the A/FX Mustangs puts his name on the lowest number. The 3 holes in the firewall of Galaxie number 824 are there when you look for them. And those 3 holes are where the next part of this story goes, because the authentication of Brannan's original Galaxie decades after it was built is one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in the entire history of factory drag racing preservation. And it turns on exactly the detail you would expect from an engineer who solved problems by cutting holes in firewalls and sourcing parts from other manufacturers and building things himself because the catalog did not have what he needed. There is a particular kind of authenticity that cannot be manufactured after the fact. Not because people do not try, because they absolutely do, and the collector car market has produced some extraordinarily creative interpretations of what the word original means when applied to a vehicle worth significant money. But because some details are so specific, so personal, so rooted in a single moment of problem-solving that only the person who created them could identify them without being told what to look for. 3 holes in a firewall are not a factory specification. They do not appear in any build sheet or engineering drawing or DST fabrication record. They exist because one man needed to run a linkage through a bulkhead, and cut the holes himself with whatever tool was available at the time and moved on to the next problem without documenting it because documentation was not the point. Winning was the point. When Kyo and Brenda Irwin of Tennessee brought Dick Brannan in to authenticate Galaxie number 824, the car that had won 65 or more events in 1963 and set 22 track records, and carried the name The Lively One through the most competitive season of Ford's early factory program, they were asking him to confirm something that the paper trail could only partially support. Production records from this era are incomplete. Dealership documentation gets lost. Cars change hands and lose their history and acquire new histories that may or may not be accurate. The collector market for significant factory drag cars has enough financial incentive attached to it that provenance claims require more than a seller's assertion to be taken seriously. Brannan looked at the car, and he identified the 3 holes he had cut in the firewall for the Studebaker Hill holder line lock linkage. Nobody else would have known those holes were there. They were not in any published account of the car. They were not in any photograph that had circulated in the enthusiast press. They were not a detail that a person researching the car from external sources could have found and then pointed to. They were there because he put them there in 1963 when he needed a line lock system and built one himself from a Studebaker part because that was what the problem required and there was no catalog option. The car was fully restored following authentication. It exists today as a documented, verified example of what Ford's factory program produced at the ground level in 1963, before the Thunderbolt, before the A/FX Mustangs, before the long-nose Holman-Moody funny cars, before any of the escalation that followed. It is the starting point made physical and permanent. And the detail that proves it is not a factory stamp or a VIN plate or a build sheet. It is 3 holes in a firewall that only one man could identify because only one man put them there. Here is what most people do not realize about preservation in the factory drag car world. The cars that survive are not always the most historically significant ones. They are the ones that happen to be kept, that happen to avoid the fate of being crashed or stripped or used as a parts source or simply discarded when they stopped being competitive. The most historically important cars from this era are often the ones that are gone, that exist only in photographs and timing slips and the memories of the people who drove them. The ones that survive are the lucky ones, and their survival is rarely the product of anyone recognizing their historical significance at the time. It is usually the product of someone keeping a car in a barn or a garage for reasons that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with attachment or inertia or the simple fact that getting rid of something takes effort. Galaxie 824 survived. Goldfinger, the 1965 A/FX Mustang that wore VIN 5F09K380230 and carried Brannan's name on the door and the Bond film's name on the quarter panel, did not survive intact in the same way. The doors from that car exist in a private collection in Indiana. The doors. Not the complete car. The doors. Which tells you something about the attrition rate for even the most significant factory race cars from this era, and also tells you that the people who kept those particular doors understood that they were keeping something worth keeping even if the rest of the car was gone. The documentary record that gives this history its most complete shape is Charles R. Morris's work. Morris interviewed Brannan directly, along with Phil Bonner, Hubert Platt, Al Joniek, Bill Lawton, and the other key participants in Ford's factory program. Thunderbolt, published in 2014, is the primary biographical account of Brannan's career. Ford Drag Team, from 2011, covers the full program context. These books are sourced from primary interviews with the people who were there, which makes them qualitatively different from secondary accounts assembled from press clippings and forum posts. Morris did the work of sitting across from the participants and asking the questions and recording the answers, and the result is a documented record that will outlast the memories of everyone involved. There is also the PBS documentary, The Lively One, Dick Brannan's Rise to Drag Racing Fame, narrated by Peter Coyote, Premiered at the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend in November of 2018. It aired nationally on PBS in 2025 and 2026. Brannan gave on-camera interviews for that documentary, which means that as recently as 2018 he was alive, coherent, and willing to talk about this history on camera. He would be in his mid to late 80s at the time I am making this video. I have seen an unverified forum post from 2022 suggesting he may have passed, but I could not find a confirmed obituary in any database I have access to. I am not going to say something definitive in either direction without sourcing I can stand behind, and I do not have that sourcing. What I can say is that the Hall of Fame record is substantial and specific. The Georgia Racing Hall of Fame, the Super Stock Magazine Hall of Fame, the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame, Class of 2004, the Drag Racers Reunion Hall of Fame, the Dearborn Classic Award. These are not participation trophies. They are institutional recognitions from organizations that exist specifically to evaluate and preserve the history of the sport, and they have evaluated Brannan's career and found it worth preserving in that way. He is not in the NHRA International Drag Racing Hall of Fame. I will note that directly and leave the observation there without elaborating on what it implies, because the implication is fairly clear to anyone who has followed the argument this video has been making for the last 40 minutes. Look, let me bring this back to the larger thing, because the Dick Brannan story is not just a story about one man's career, as remarkable as that career was. It is a story about a specific moment in American automotive and motorsport history when the factories decided that winning races was worth spending serious money on, and the people they put in charge of spending that money made decisions that permanently altered the shape of the sport. The 6 years between 1962 and 1967, when Brannan was running Ford's drag program from the inside, are the years when drag racing transformed from a competition between modified production cars into something that required entirely new institutional categories to describe. The escalation logic of that era is worth sitting with for a moment. Factory super stock in 1962. Factory lightweights with fiberglass panels and aluminum bumpers in 1963. The Thunderbolt with its ram air scoops and stripped interior and reworked engine bay in 1964. The A/FX Mustangs with their SOHC 427s and Holman-Moody torsion front suspensions and polycarbonate windows in 1965. The Bronco, altered wheelbase, match racing weapon, proto-funny car in 1965. The long-nose Holman-Moody scratch-built tube-frame cars wearing fiberglass Mustang bodies and running nitromethane through Hilborn injectors and classified by NHRA as fuel dragsters in 1966. Each step in that progression followed from the previous one with a logic that was clear at the time even if the destination was not visible from the starting point. And Brannan was not watching that progression happen. He was building it, conceiving the Thunderbolt and arranging the DST build, coordinating the Holman-Moody A/FX program and putting his name on the lowest VIN. Building the Bronco with his own hands when the competitive situation required an answer that the program had not yet produced. Running the long-nose fleet and making the development decisions that took those cars to the edge of what the sanctioning structure could accommodate and then past it. All of this while driving competitively enough to win 65 events in a single season, set track records at venues across the country, and reach a national event final a decade into his career. There is also the Super Mustang program, which deserves at least a brief accounting because it shows how ambitious Ford's thinking was even at the very end of the factory era. Ford commissioned the Loge brothers to build a full dragster with a Mustang-shaped body. Connie Kalitta built the injected 427 SOHC engine. Tom McEwen drove it. Brannan and Chuck Falger from Ford Special Vehicles were heavily involved in the program. The body was designed at Ford's Design Center and tested in the Ford Wind Tunnel, a corporation putting a dragster through an aerodynamic wind tunnel in the mid-1960s. The car debuted at the 1967 Winter Nationals and ran 8.60 at 180 miles per hour, which sounds impressive until you check what Kalita himself ran to win the top fuel class that same day. 7.17 at 218 miles per hour. The Super Mustang was a promotional exercise and the Times confirmed it. It ran a handful of passes and faded from the scene, and with it the factory era effectively ended. This is where it gets really interesting in terms of what the whole arc means. The Super Mustang is a useful endpoint because it shows Ford reaching for something spectacular at the moment when the factory program was already being wound down, trying to make one final statement with a car that turned out to be more interesting as a concept than as a competitor. It is the last gesture of a program that had spent 6 years making gestures that actually worked, and the fact that this one did not work does not diminish what came before it. It clarifies it. The things that worked because they were built by someone who understood the problem deeply enough to solve it. The Super Mustang was built to make a statement, and statement making is a different discipline than problem solving, and Brannan was a problem solver. So let us close the loop on the thing we opened with, because we started with a correction and corrections deserve to land cleanly. Dandy Dick was Dick Landy, Dodge's man. Hot rod writer Eric Dahlquist coined that nickname in 1964 describing Landy's obsessively clean presentation, his spotless cars arriving at tracks looking like they had just rolled out of a showroom. The name stuck to Landy specifically, and it belonged to Landy specifically, and the confusion between the two Dicks has followed Ford's factory program around ever since, like a persistent case of mistaken identity that nobody bothered to correct because correcting it required knowing both stories well enough to see where they had been conflated. Brannan's name was Mr. Ford. His car was called the Lively One. He was the man who conceived the Thunderbolt and drove the first one. He was the man who put his name on VIN 5F09K380230 and called it Goldfinger and ran it through a season that proved the SOHC 427 was the most powerful thing Ford had ever built for competition. He was the man who built the Bronco with his own hands because the match race circuit needed an answer, and he was the person responsible for providing one. He was the engineer who cut 3 holes in a firewall and sourced a Studebaker part and built a line lock system himself because the catalog did not have what he needed and winning did not wait for catalogs. He built the funny car category before the funny car category had a name. He reached a national event pro stock final 10 years into his career and ran a 9.60 that was not quite fast enough to beat Bill Jenkins on one of Jenkins' best days, which is a sentence that describes a competitor operating at the highest level of the sport a decade after his first-class win. He accumulated more than 200 documented victories across a career that spanned the most transformative period in American drag racing history and left institutional fingerprints on every significant development that happened in Ford's program during those years. That is the Dick Brannan story. And now you know it correctly.